to welcome you all to tonight's event celebrating World Poetry Day 2022. I'd like to start by acknowledging Wadawurrung and Eastern Ma original owners of the land on which our library services operate. This is Wadawurrung land. We acknowledge and celebrate the First Nations peoples of this land as the custodians of learning, literacy, knowledge and story. After COVID cancellations in 20 and 21, we're so pleased to be celebrating World Poetry Day once again here at the Dome on Wurdi Youang. This event is an important part of our annual calendar and is in fact the 10th year we have staged this celebration of poetry. We're proud to observe this day and use it as an opportunity to showcase the work of our many very talented regional poets. World Poetry Day was declared by UNESCO in 1999 with the purpose of promoting the reading, writing, publishing and teaching of poetry throughout the world. And tonight we celebrate by acknowledging 4 of our very own incredibly talented poets. This evening we will have the pleasure of hearing readings from Cameron Lowe, David McCooey, Joe Langdon and Rose Lucas. And our MC this evening is John Bartlett. And a special thanks to Yvonne Adami for her continued support. I can't see you, Yvonne. Where are you? Oh, there you are, right at the front. For your continued support and enthusiasm, thank you. And for all your hard work towards this event. And before we get going, I just wanted to let you know, I'm very pleased to let you know that this year's Word for Word National Non-Fiction Festival, which I'm sure many of you have enjoyed previously, has been reinvented. It now reflects our new COVID normal for this year as a locally focused 2-day event designed to celebrate and showcase our region's amazing creative and literary talent. We never forget that we are a public library and ultimately our purpose is to deliver a thriving public library service that boosts our community, health, prosperity, connectedness and belonging. And so the Local Word Regional Showcase will be for readers and writers and will have a strong focus on bringing our diverse local writing communities together and highlighting this region as a cultural destination. Our strategic plan, Connecting and Thriving, states that we will be known for leading regional recovery and using our core strength for community good. And so the Local Word program, with Kolokotwe Shire Libraries joining us this year too, will include writers, readers, poets, illustrators and other creatives living in the region. And it will feature writers' workshops, panel discussions on popular aspects of the writing process, author events. There'll be plenty of social opportunities for developing collaborative opportunities. And we'll also plan a stream that will be branded Word for Word whilst we think about our future and what that looks like. So please mark it in your diaries. It's scheduled in August, the Friday the 26th and Saturday the 27th of August. And there'll be an EOIs coming out and full program events coming. Now, back to tonight's poetry. It's my pleasure to introduce our MC for the evening, John Bartlett. Many of you will know that John is the author of 3 novels, collections of short stories and non-fiction, as well as 3 collections of poetry. His poetry has been widely published in Australian and overseas journals, and his poems have also been included in recent Australian anthologies, including Poetry for the Planet and the Ros Spencer Poetry Contest anthology. He was winner of the 2020 Ada Cambridge Poetry Prize and highly commended in the 2021 Mundering Poetry Competition. John is also a great friend and supporter of the Geelong Regional Libraries. Please join me in welcoming our MC for the rest of the evening, John Bartlett.
Thank you very much, Vanessa, for that very kind introduction. And I just want to acknowledge how wonderful it is to be here this evening to return to World Poetry Day celebration. The last one, as you remember, was in 2019, so like a lot of organisations, we've had a little bit of a pause time in between. So it's wonderful that the library has supported this return, and I'm very also happy to hear Vanessa telling us too that the library is returning to supporting another festival this year. The Geelong Library has been such a wonderful support for local writers, that's for sure. And those of you who were here in 2019 may remember that one of the poets that evening who read was our friend and colleague Graham Kinross Smith, and very sadly Graham has passed away in the meantime. And I understand that David McCooey has some words just to say about Graham, how much he's missed and how much a friend he was to writing and literature. Thanks, David.
Thank you, John. And yes, I'm very honoured to be talking about Graham today. I first met Graham in 1995 when I started working at Deakin University, which, yes, was a long time ago. Graham was then, and until the end, an honorary fellow in the School of Communication and Creative Arts, and he was a marvellous presence at the Warren Ponds campus. I and many others had many enjoyable and enlightening conversations with him over the years. He was an incredibly generous colleague, and he was especially well known for his mentorship of Deakin staff and creative writing students, all of whom were lucky to have his sensitive expertise to draw upon. I should add that Graham was the first lecturer in creative writing in Australia at the Gordon Institute of Technology just across the road, before joining staff at Deakin, from which he retired as a senior lecturer in 1991. As well as an educator, he was, of course, an important writer, and his major works include Australia's Writers from 1980, which, for someone my age, was an utterly essential reference work for students of Australian literature before the invention of the internet. Fantastic book. As well as the novel The Long Afternoon of the World from 2007, and the poetry collection Available Light, which I'll read from later. He was also known as a photographer. You always saw him with a camera. I did love that about him. A jazz aficionado, a tennis player, and a swimmer. What a great combination of things. His absence is profoundly felt, or to put it another way, we miss Graham greatly. Our hearts go out to Judith and her family. So to end, I would like to read one of his poems. He was a fine poet, with a great range and a style that was all his own. This poem from his collection Available Light, which is a photographic term, is called Magic Lantern, and, as you probably know, the magic lantern was an early type of image projector, and as such, beautifully brings together Graham's poetic and photographic interests. Magic Lantern. Bird mimics pretend to know. Listen, an axe, a chainsaw you'd swear was real. And there's the sun. Breaks through, then steps back, talking to itself in leaves. Kids love it when a river comes alight. Ocean too lays itself out. A page, prima facie, always folding. Inland, evening paints branches in its gold regret. At dusk, it doesn't take much. My bike's small light spooks 30 heifers into ballet on the hill. Meanwhile, the bazaar sells amulets to strip jealousy from love. Anyone asks, I still play pourquoi, my toes questioning the precipice's lip, houses far below, so small that might be home. To Graham.
Thank you very much, David, for that beautiful tribute to Graham, and reading from that wonderful collection, All Available Light, one of my favourite books of his. And also his book on writing, the title, which I can't recall now, was the very reason that I started writing seriously. So thank you, Graham. We're all here this evening either because we're poets or we like reading and writing poetry. And but we probably ask ourselves too at some time, what is poetry after all? And we're not going to spend this evening tossing that question around, except perhaps just to say a few people did have a few descriptions. Wordsworth said that poetry was the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility, which sounds pretty Wordsworth. But then Oscar Wilde said in his own inimitable way, a poet can survive everything but a misprint. So you're not going to get descriptions of poetry tonight, but you have the opportunity of listening to poems from these writers here this evening. And we're starting with some readings, firstly from Cameron Lowe. Now, Cameron, I'm sure, is known to many of you. Is the author of 2 book-length collections of poetry, Porch Music, which was published by Whitmore Press in 2010, and Circle Work, which was published by Puncher and Watman in 2013. His poetry is featured in the anthologies 30 Australian Poets, University of Queensland Press, 2011, Contemporary Australian Poetry, published by Puncher and Watman in 2016, and Homings and Departures, selected poems from contemporary China and Australia, published by Recent Word Press in 2021. And Cameron does live in Geelong, one of our own poets. Thanks, Cameron.
Thank you, John. Lovely to see everyone here tonight. I thought I'd start with a poem by the American poet Frank O'Hara, just as an act of homage, but also because one of my students, who we have class with tomorrow, Eve, is here, and Eve is a big fan of Frank O'Hara. For Grace, after a party. You do not always know what I am feeling. Last night in the warm spring air, while I was blazing my tirade against someone who doesn't interest me, it was love for you that set me afire. And isn't it odd? For in rooms full of strangers, my most tender feelings writhe and bear the fruit of screaming. Put out your hand. Isn't there an ashtray suddenly there, beside the bed? And someone you love enters the room and says, wouldn't you like the eggs a little different today? And when they arrive, they're just plain scrambled eggs, and the warm weather is holding. Go, Frank. Although we're here to celebrate poetry, it's also the beginning of the football season. And this is a little prose piece along those lines. Ascent. When I was a child, I met the best footballer of all time in the local sports shop. I thought him the best. My grandmother said it was true. She kept a portrait magnet of him on the fridge. My father, who was with me, said, I thought he was bigger. He looked huge to me. His neck bulged enormously from his white t-shirt. He smiled when he shook my hand. A decade and a half later, I met him again at the local pub. A lot had changed. He was still in the news, but not for football. His grey suit sat oddly on his shoulders. He was shorter than I was. I think he was drunk. I was drunk. He was still the best footballer of all time. I couldn't stop looking at him. He offered me a slice of cold pizza. True story. I'll read a couple of poems from my book Circle Work. Something like a leaf. The leaf is the size of a man's hand turning in the breeze, turning through the cool light at the edge of summer, to which sparrows give voice as dawn unwinds. Find it there, beside the blue flowers of the twisting vine, by the rose that blooms pink then red above the fence line that is the limit of sight from the precise angle of. Find it swaying in the clean promise of things to come, of which you might say, she will give grace that bore the printed flower, each birth, each death in this garden of proven law. Find it in any manner that summons that rich texture that is nothing like the feel of the silk she wears close to her skin, nor the feel of her skin that wakes you in the night. Find it completely by surprise, noting the perfect symmetry of veins that glow a bright lime when the sun turns the corner of the house where she wanders, dreaming in the gift of sleep. Find it, noting its shape that is something like a heart, but more comely, something like a thought, but more defined, something nurtured at the margins of the leaf itself. This one's a little bit of a homage as well to the brilliant British poet Lee Harwood, who died in 2015. Beginning and ending with a line by Lee Harwood. Your kiss holds such towns of quietness and creaking pines. I, you, they open the door onto falling snow. There is nothing to be said, nothing done. At the green end of winter, all is white and so cold, it burns a pale fire to carry cupped in the palms. Your kiss holds such towns. This little poem emerged out of the first lockdown. And many of you may have experienced this kind of scene, given it's a very Geelong scene. Seam. Down by the carousel, fishermen are back in droves. Nights, there's talk of what comes next. A rainbow lingers over the city. The baby waves to bollards, seagulls, couples sipping coffee out of paper cups. The bitter edge to it, what comes next? Painted horses stuck in pose, fins of dolphin, dark beyond the pier. And I have no idea how we're going with our 8 minutes of time, but this will be the last poem. I hope we have some Clint Eastwood fans out there. This poem has a rather long title. Late morning Western reverie as raindrops turn rivulets, trickling visions of trickle-down economics on the pane. I thought it was Josie Wales who said it in The Outlaw Josie Wales, but he didn't. Wales said, to hell with them fellas, buzzards got to eat same as worms. He said, Diane ain't much of a living boy. It was John Vernon said, don't piss down my back and tell me it's raining. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cameron. I was just realising while you were reading how Geelong-oriented your poetry is. I'm going to nominate you as the Poet Laureate of Geelong tonight. Thank you. As Vanessa said at the beginning, today we're celebrating World Poetry Day, which was set up by United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organisation, otherwise known as UNESCO, in 1999. And it's probably worth thinking about how poetry came about. It's believed that the earliest poetry came with the Epic of Gilgamesh, sometime around 2000 BC. But it's likely that poetry existed even before the spread of literacy. And the oral recitation of poetry was a way of transferring stories from generation to generation without written text. And I think poetry still retains that sort of feel today. And I'm really pleased tonight to introduce our next poet, Rose Lucas, who we can't exactly say is a Geelong poet. She's actually from Melbourne, but she's had such contact with Deakin University, and I've attended one of her poetry workshops here in Geelong, so I think we can claim her as a bit of a Geelongite. Rose is an academic at Victoria University, and her first collection of poetry, Even in the Dark, in 2013, won the Mary Gilmore Award. Her second collection, Unexpected Clearing, was published in 2016. Her third collection, The Shattered Eye, was published in 2021. Increments of Every Day will appear in 2022, published by Puncher and Watman. And she's also a founding editor at Liquid Amber Press. Anybody poet can publish in 2021, I think, needs a huge round of applause. The worst possible year, I think, to publish. So thanks, Rose. We're looking forward to hearing from you this evening.
Thanks very much, John. I'm glad you mentioned that I was a bit of a ring-in. But anyway, I'm very pleased and honoured. No, you didn't use that word, but anyway, I'm very pleased and honoured to be an honorary Geelong poet. So thank you for having me. The first poem I'd like to read comes from my most recent book, This Shuttered Eye. And it's called Poetry and Breathing. And I guess it's really about the relationship between what we write, what I might write, and the body, this machine that keeps on breathing in and out. Paired back to the clarity of line, flowing into line, maybe every poem is about breathing, about re-inscribing the certainty, for now at least, of rise and fall, an anchor in wild waters and calm, the almost unbearable simplicity of in and out. The cool air I invite into the habitation of my body, its invisible conduits, the welcome tide of bright blood and spark of neuron that searches me out, washing me in the salty pathways of life. The warmed breath that flows from me and back into the world, I am its creature. A body swimming in channels of air, the steady and the variable beating of words, and white spaces, pulsing an interplay of note and rest, ornament and pause, while always the deep thrum of silence, its potential to disrupt, to splinter the sheen of surface. This next poem comes from a series of poems in this book, This Shuttered Eye, which respond really explicitly to visual art. So I was really enjoying playing with that possibility. So this poem, Woman at a Window, is in dialogue with, if you like, a painting by Edward Hopper. And if you know any Edward Hopper, you know that there's lots of women at windows with lights coming in and women looking out. This one, Cape Cod Morning, 1950. Woman at a window. Old west-facing boards warp in relentless summer heat. The rolling in of cloud and wind, perfume of dust. Weathering, I wear, heavy on my skin, deep in my joints, the drumbeats of time, finding myself still here through persistent nights and unfolding days. A sudden angle might still fall across these watching eyes, an unexpected generosity of light. If you look carefully, you can see the peel of paint, an architecture of lines no longer plumb, a woman breathing in the world. Relief of salty air, swirl of curtains, diaphanous as clouds, catching breath, drawing me on. Now, I was going to read another poem, but I had a great little snippet of conversation with Rosemary earlier about poems about our parents. And I just thought I was inspired to share this poem, which is called Corridor, and it's in memory of both my parents, actually, Val and Ken, although my dad was not with us at the time that this occurred. Corridor. You shuffle the length of the hospital corridor in this fog of terrible and abrupt diminishment. Laboriously inching the walking frame forward. When we pass an elderly man being wheeled the other way, a glimpse of grey tonsured hair, pyjamas, and "Our dad?" you cry out with a jolt of almost forgotten energy. Is that our dad? And suddenly, we are both fallen through a fold in time. The unexpected gentleness of sunlight, where decrepit muscles reanimate and you lean toward him, alert, all your focus here and ready to take up again a life somehow mislaid. Then the moment is gone, dispersed, and disappointment resettles, clouding your eye, loosening this already fragile carapace. We can't go on. This is a different sort of poem. This poem is called There Is a Tree, and it was actually inspired, I read The Overstory by Richard Powers. I don't know how many of you have read that doorstop of a book about trees and their relationship to the human world. But anyway, I read it and went out and looked at the world and thought, my gosh, it's all alive. Anyway, this poem comes out of that experience. There is a tree. There is a tree whose roots reach, tenacious, into layers of sift, a fibrous tangle, a loving and a lapping of threads that search out through murmuring grains of darkness and congregations of organism, sometimes even an unexpected emergence into light, or not. What is below the crust of the visible supports it, feeding the eye's cartography, the life that is lived in the complexity of leaves, turning with the roll of the planet, the uncertainty of the wind, plaited into place. There has always been more than can be held in a single mind. Its limited capacity for seeing patterns, humbled by the breathing of the treed world, open hands, fingers, voice, wide weave of twine and touch, unthreading filigree root, texture of bark, a seed ready now, cracking in fire. And my last poem for the evening comes out of this book, 2020, Shelter in Place. So, the COVID didn't stop us. The brains and the writing hands kept on going. And I was fortunate enough to be in a collaboration with a visual artist. So we had a wonderful series, had an exhibition of the art, and she and I really bounced off each other to create work. So this poem is called Further. I wrote it in April 2020, so it's nearly, exactly 2 years ago. That sense of being in the mildness of autumn, but, as Cameron was commenting before, what did it all mean? Where the heck were we going? It starts with a quote from a book by Sarah Watt and William McInnes, Worst Things Happen at Sea, where she says, I love our house. It's probably a bit of a dump to some, or a castle to others, but for me, it's a light-filled container full of people I love. And I guess that really resonated with me at the time as we all turned our way inward into our own houses. Further, the sanctity of this marked out space, this collective turning inwards, the quiet comfort of walls, angle of stair, our bed creaking as we turn, ripening of garden figs in afternoon light, or voices drifting down a corridor. while streaming away like photons dissolving in air, the further world still lies, bemused and utterly beautiful beneath a creamy sun. Its fields and stony rises, streets and verandas, all tipped skywards and slipping gently from summer's ferocious grip, waiting for us, as though through a frosted pane we had never really seen it before, rolling out its carpet of recurrent green, never stood amongst the low thrumming of unfolding seasons, or travelled its wide and gusting territories of shift and hold and shift. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rose. I love the way you make that connection between poetry and art, particularly I think in your collection, The Shuttered Eye. You do that so beautifully. It reminds us of how the arts do connect, and even music and poetry and art. Reminded me of a quote from musician Leonard Cohen. You probably know a lot of his lyrics, but he did say something about poetry. He said that poetry is just the evidence of life. If your life is burning well, poetry is just the ash. So there's a thought for you to hang on to for the next few minutes, because not only have we food for the soul this evening, but the library's kindly provided food for the body as well. So we're having a short break. If you'd like to come back about 25 past the hour, whatever the hour is. I've lost control of the hour, but about 45 minutes break. Please come back and enjoy yourselves in the meantime. That's very organised of everybody. I didn't even have to call you back to your seats. So you obviously want to hear some more. And I've been wondering how you've been going with that. I presume you've been discussing your definitions of poetry during the break too. What is poetry? No? No, I think it's probably easier to just listen to the poets, and there's probably as many definitions of poetry as there are people in the room. But I did read one that I thought was quite good from Robert Frost, the American poet, who said, "Poetry provides the one permissible way of saying one thing and meaning another." And he also said poetry is what gets lost in translation. And then he said, a poem begins with a lump in the throat. And I think there are those moments in poetry too that really move us very much. And I'd like to introduce to you now our next poet for this evening, David McCooey, who spoke to you earlier. Now, David is a prize-winning poet, and as many of our poets here are prize-winning poets. He's a critic and an editor, also lives in Geelong, and he's the author of 4 collections of poetry, the latest of which is Starstruck. His work has appeared in 10 of the last 11 years of the Best Australian Poems series, and he's been widely anthologised elsewhere. He's also a composer and sound artist. We were mentioning earlier the connection between poetry and music and art. His most recent album is The Apartment with Paul Hetherington, and he's also a Professor of Writing and Literature at Deakin University. Thanks, David.
Thanks, John. I wrote that bit. I was thinking today, as poets probably do occasionally, what my favourite word in the English language was, and I came up with one in a bolt of inspiration like a poet: daybed. Yeah, I mean, it's 2 perfectly lovely words, day and bed, put together. Daybed. I just couldn't come up with something better. I dream of having a daybed in my office. Maybe that's why I came up with that idea. Anyway, getting on to more serious things, I'm going to read a handful of poems tonight. The first one is far less fun than a daybed. It's just bringing us back down to earth, given that earth is so problematic at the moment. And hopefully after this one it will pick up a little bit. But this one is called Anthropocene, which is the name proposed for the geological epoch in which we live, in which human beings are affecting the environment. Even now, at this late hour, there is a world entirely free of names. No days of the week, no anniversaries or hours, even when the air is free of light or rife with backlit insects. No epochs, not even that augural one we have named after ourselves. Words span the globe, islands of garbage, bags of oily waste. On a more positive note, I will read one poem from Starstruck, the last book of mine that came out, which, like Graham's collection that I was reading earlier tonight, is called Available Light. His interest in photography is one I share. And I think there's probably quite a bit of... I'm not the poet laureate of Geelong by any means, and it's a shame Cameron's not here, because I was going to ask him who that footballer was he was talking about earlier. But anyway, there is quite a lot of Geelong in this poem. Available Light. Office blocks thrust into buffeting daylight. Houses hunker under pale suburban skies. A low-slung cat crosses the photographic dusk. The science fiction lighting of deserted 7-Elevens. The outdated starlight. A night walker passes the TV blue of windows. A phosphorescent frisbee muses on the porch. Sentinel LEDs on consoles and microwave clock. Fridge glow upon the subtle slate and stainless steel. The mirror's unnatural magic. And on that sort of nighttime theme, I have a poem which is rather more satirical called Dreams. The rest of the poems are coming out next year in a book called The Book of Falling. So this one is called Dreams, and I hope you don't take the opening lines amiss, but this is kind of the point, that we're not really in control of our dreams. And the first line refers to the id, which in Freudian theory, of course, is the part of the psyche that the part you can't control. It just has base desires. So dreams. Your id doesn't give a fuck about cultural appropriation or what is appropriate in the workplace. It takes you half the morning to shake off the memory of that improper kiss or the leisurely slow-mo sense of falling. Dreams are slow, not Taylor Swift. They will not let you go when all you want is to make it out the house into the actual morning, populated by innocent birds, the neutral sound of traffic, and the insane barking of the neighbour's dog. That's not yours, by the way, Kate. Sorry, Jill. Which must be hounded by unknown wordless dreams of freedom, or, more likely, the recall of canine pack hierarchy, where everything is as it seems. And talking about everything as it seems, I was thinking the other day, having a 13-year-old son, how little television has to do with his life, which for someone like me who grew up in the 70s is kind of amazing, because that's all we had, as I keep telling him. So I thought I would write an elegy for television, so that's what this is. Not that television is entirely dead, but I think you know where I'm coming from. 1. Space junk for a moon landing. Its cold lunar light blue-rinsed a billion chambers. Our radio-age parents were held in its dazzle, even as they repurposed for their children that old zombie theory from the age of the novel. 2. We thought TVs were everywhere, but bars, waiting rooms and airports were all innocent of their presence. The news crawl was a thing of the future. 3. TV was an almost portal for the vacant times, after school, endless Sundays, up too late. It squatted on our lives, first teacher of desire, parsed as eros and violence. It inaugurated us into the ritual of the jump scare, and proved that spectacle is everything happening at once. Wimbledon, Evel Knievel, the wonderment of royalty, reports of assassinations, disaster upon disaster, like flaming logs collapsing in the fireplace. And talking of disasters, I'll finish with another slightly environmentally themed poem. This one is called The Birds, and it does reference the Hitchcock film The Birds, but it's, to quote Cameron, it is a true story. A while back, a crested pigeon decided to start attacking our house on a daily basis, presumably because it saw itself in reflections and thought of it was seeing some other bird, wanting to mate the female birds around. Anyway, I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but when a bird decides to attack your house, it's really hard to get rid of them, which is pretty much what this poem's about, but there's other things going on underneath as well, as I suggest. So the birds. One day after the fires, birds started attacking our house. Not like in the old movie, appearing in their hundreds and killing innocent townsfolk. Of course not. These were just a couple of birds appearing every day to smash their beaks against our windows, as if to say, "Knock, knock, who's there? We are small and persistent, filled with unconscious will. Only your slow-mo, gigantic bodies and unlovely voices will scare us away, but only for a while, until we return, shooting where we do and attacking the hard competitors that look just like us, and which, like us, never go away." And so my wife hangs up imitation owls, blinding streamers and short-lived bells. She scours the far horizons of the internet for solutions, none of which are effective. Sometimes she even wishes for a small rifle, like the kind her bird-loving father used to have, shooting, without remorse, the fruit-thieving birds on his property until the gun laws changed and he resorted to nets. Meanwhile, my wife's friend dreams about the birds attacking our house. What does it mean, she wonders, sending a book of poems, divinations that give no answer. Though 16 centuries ago, the king of Alasia put great store in the tidings of an eagle diviner from Egypt. Inside our house, glass avian artwork from Scandinavia reminds us that we love what we kill or dream of killing. It's surely obvious, just like in Hitchcock's film, what the birds have to tell us, beating their beaks until they bleed, leaving their pitiful message, higgledy-piggledy, on our estate. Thank you very much.
David, thank you very much for that. You might have noticed that we're missing one poet tonight, and that's Maria Takolander, who was on the original program. Sadly, Maria wasn't able to be with us this evening, but I didn't want to let this evening pass without mentioning the wonderful award that she's recently won, which is the Victorian Premier's Literary Award for Poetry. So I think we should give her a good... And just before we move on to the last reader, which means the evening's gone very quickly, I just want to say a little bit about poetry as in difficult times, which is, I imagine, is the times that we're living in now, times of great trauma. Poetry can be a huge support. The words of poetry, I think, can really go somehow deep within us and help us to keep going. And in reading about poetry recently, I came across a Ukrainian poet by the name of Helena Kruk, who's a poet, a translator, and a medieval literature professor at Lviv State University. And I came across some words of hers that I found particularly moving, which I think really emphasise how poetry what it can do to our souls. And she says, We stopped digging deep long ago in this uncertain field of ours. Yours because all kinds of junk can turn up. Human bones, horses' heads, unexploded mines. Now, our final part for the evening is Jo Langdon, after those happy words. Jo is also one of our Geelong poets, and she's the author of 2 poetry collections, Snowline, which was published by Whitmore Press in 2012, and Glass Life, which was published by Five Islands Press in 2018. She's not only a poet but a fiction writer, and in 2020 her short fiction was recognised in the Newcastle and Olga Masters Short Story Awards. And in 2018 she was a fellow of the Elizabeth Kostova Foundation's Sosopol Fiction Seminars and Capital Literature Festival in Bulgaria. Jo's recent writing also appears in journals such as Ireland, Meanjin, Overland and Southerly. She currently lives and writes on unceded Wathaurong land. Welcome, Jo.
Thanks everyone, and for coming out tonight. It's really lovely to be here, kind of two years later, but also now for what now is too. I thought I'd read my own sort of pandemic capsule poem, which guiltily, I guess, appears or was a commission for the Poet Laureates of Melbourne series. So although I am proudly a Geelong poet, sometimes when it suits by invitation, I'm happy to pass as a Melbourne poet. And this was one of those occasions, I think in 2020, the Melbourne City of Literature started a Melbourne Poet Laureates of Melbourne series, and they invited poets to respond to a commission with quite a fast turnaround. So I think I had about a week from being notified. These poems came out to people's inboxes on a Saturday, and there was about a week's turnaround, including editing. So in some ways, the poem is quite fresh, and it certainly put pressure on how I might usually write. So this was just called May 9th, 2020, though I think I also gave it the title Verge. Thin, bright air in and out of my lungs this morning, with an ease and grace I'm quick these days to feel thanks for. Peach sky over lavender water, then too many joggers pushing ahead their breath, too close on the path beside us. At 15 months, my daughter wants to wave to them all. Splendour of bats in the park, pines rich with their sounds, clasped bodies, visible weight of them, reshaping each bough. I'd like to lift my face to them, hold them in view a little longer. Daily the words, when this is over, as though it's possible to turn back through so many doors, to look past all that's surfaced, what it means to have and lose made visible or not, I guess, by vantage point. Through the week, feeling I don't want to write a gimmick. Literalists of imagination, nonetheless, we are most days out from under the doona on toddler time. Awake she is alive to birdsong, our naming of gulls and cormorants, mudlarks et al. Here are edges, thresholds and love, stark as in Ivan Boland's Quarantine, and its nightfall under freezing stars. Her gleaming lines that build, open and compress, that hold and make us in space. So the other quick thing to say about that poem is that it needed to refer to something that had happened sort of quite recently in the world or in the news. And so for me it was discovering the work of Ivan Boland, the Irish poet who tragically died, or whose work I was sad to only learn of through learning of her death. And also I think there's a kind of paraphrasing of something Scott Morrison said about getting Australia not keeping Australia under the doona, or something along those lines. So I'll read a newer poem called Inflorescence, and it begins with an epigraph from the Polish poet Wisława Szymborska. The epigraph is, "So work, work, and more work. History or myth, picture tulip bulbs, unburied like onions. An onion is the likeness, Hepburn in Gardens of the World, proffers in the purr and lilt of vowel, halt of consonant, enunciation that lifts ready from memory the mise-en-scène of gulped marbles, Elizad's triumph in rise and soar of voice. I can do without you. Don't speak, don't waste my time, show me. An onion too is what the PM of then opens his jaws onto, mouth into brown paper skin and wet flesh, lunar glow and crunch of white, translucent in allusions to green. And this seems wasteless, at least, the peel intact and taken in. The onion hasn't a centre to reach, stone cord touch with any tooth, knife, nail. I didn't know before the poem's work how Audrey's voice for Eliza was dubbed, sometimes doubled, the ghost singer credited, barely if at all. How from this a whole ghost chorus lifts in each point of silence and of speaking over, where thought holds some enjambment, wanting as desire or lack. The poem won't work towards cohesion, skirts by verb each point of focus. Only this resolve of wanting, present in each sense, stretch of here and gift that reaches for and outwards on. And I'll just read a couple of short poems which are found texts taken from the correspondence of a Polish author a Polish artist, a sculptor. So I was really pleased to hear John refer to the way that different forms of artwork kind of interact with each other, including the visual arts and poetry. So recently I've started to write some work that responds to the Polish sculptor Alina Szapoknikov. And I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with her biography, but she has led quite an extraordinary life. As a child or teenager, she survived the Holocaust death camps and survived tuberculosis through experimental antibiotic treatment, and she tragically died very young, in her mid to late 40s, after enduring breast cancer. The tragedies of her biography sort of have tended apparently to overshadow her artworks, which are themselves really extraordinary. And I guess I've cheated a little bit in drawing from her own words here and recomposing them. So these poems are based on letters that she wrote to the art critic Ryszard Stanislavski, and I'm hoping my pronunciation, I have been practicing, but I'm not sure that it's great yet. So there's an epigraph for this poem in which Alina writes, "They don't even have ink in this dump. There are no cliffs here at all, like you imagine. They're magnificent hills covered in grass. Cows walk in a dignified, milky, serious manner, nipping at the fragrant meadows, the bells on their necks slowly ringing pure tone. It's only when you get up into the clouds that there are really cliffs, but they're far." So these are sort of excerpts from a longer sequence. I'll say that this is 2. "Forgive me this awful light blue paper, it's all I've got. Outside, even the horses breathed out, white steam above the white snow, the sun completely pink, or the sky looked just exactly like the cheap kitsch. It is cold there too." 3. Another epigraph. "Sometimes this life here seems unreal, precisely because it's purely corporeal. This pen writes beautifully, it's just that I lie wrong, and from this position the letters come out crooked. hospital life, the smell of ether, of disinfected filth. Everything is white and aquamarine. Even I am light blue, insipid. But just beside me there, life, lovely, desired, anticipated, and nearby, very red, almost glowing, little roses. And you are there again. Coffee with milk, very good, bread with jam, peaches. The room is lovely, clean, a radio around, 20 young women, 3 maids, a nurse, etc. Meanwhile, you are no doubt already sprouting angel's wings. Check above your shoulder blade. Parenthetically, soft pencil girl with braids. And I'll leave it there for tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jo. Thank you. Sadly, that's the last poet that we've got for the evening. I don't know about you, but the evening's gone very quickly for me. How wonderful it is, though, to hear poetry being spoken again in Geelong, and particularly like to thank the Geelong Library very much for resurrecting World Poetry Day, and particularly for Yvonne Adami for her work in starting this celebration and continuing it today. So let's just congratulate the poets again for wonderful readings.